It is the summer of 1984. Somewhere over the North Sea, an RAF flight lieutenant by the name of Mike Hale is doing something which, according to the Americans, simply cannot be done. He is flying an English Electric Lightning F-6, a 1960s interceptor that the Royal Air Force has stubbornly refused to retire long after the rest of NATO has decided it ought to be in a museum. His altimeter is winding through 60,000 feet, then 65,000, then 70,000. Both Rolls-Royce Avon engines are in full reheat, fuel pouring away at a frankly hysterical rate, the aircraft pointed at the heavens like an artillery shell. Above him, cruising in serene Cold War contempt, sits a Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft deployed across the Atlantic to RAF Alconbury in Cambridgeshire. It is loitering in the rarefied stratosphere above 70,000 feet. The altitude band, the CIA, the United States Air Force, and even NASA themselves have certified as an absolute sanctuary. No fighter, the Americans have insisted in briefing after briefing, can reach a U-2 up there. Not theirs. Not the Soviets. And certainly not the British. Hale pulls back on the stick. The Lightning, all stubby wings and obscene thrust, climbs. It zooms. It claws. It refuses, with a kind of mechanical stubbornness peculiar to British military aviation, to acknowledge any limit that has not first been beaten out of it with a spanner. At an indicated 88,000 feet, by Hale's own gun camera, the U-2 is squarely in his sights. He has the photograph. He has the lock. He has done, in a 25-year-old British interceptor, what the most expensive military-industrial complex on Earth has just sworn could not be done. When he lands at RAF Binbrook in Lincolnshire, the gun camera footage travels with him. Within hours, it is in the hands of Strike Command. Within days, it has reached the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall. And by the end of the week, a peculiar silence has descended over the supposed inviolability of the U-2's operating altitude. This is not the first time the Lightning has done this. It is merely the latest. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, RAF pilots had been quietly bouncing American U-2s and SR-71 Blackbirds in airspace where, according to every NATO briefing document, only one side was permitted to operate. They had been doing it on Afterburner, on a wing and a prayer, often with fuel margins measured in seconds. They had been doing it because the Lightning, despite its absurd thirst, its short legs and its eye-watering accident rate, was capable of one thing no other interceptor in the West could match. It could climb. My word, could it climb? This is the story of how a small, shrinking British aerospace industry, throttled half to death by post-war austerity and the constant threat of treasury cancellation, built the most outrageous interceptor of the Cold War. It is the story of the engineers at English Electric who refused to accept that Britain had become a second-rate power. It is the story of the men at Binbrook and Wattisham and Leuchars who took an aircraft designed to shoot down Soviet bombers over the North Sea and used it, instead, to embarrass the Americans, terrify the Russians, and rewrite the rulebook on what an interceptor could do. And it begins, as so much of Britain's Cold War history begins, with a desperate decision taken in Whitehall in the bleak grey shadow of a war we had won but could no longer afford. Britain, in the early 1950s, is a country in retreat from itself. The flags are still flying over the empire, just about, but the Treasury ledger tells a different story. Rationing of certain goods will not end until 1954. The pound has been devalued, painfully, in 1949. The Indian Empire is gone. Palestine is gone. Burma is gone. And in the corridors of the Air Ministry, an uncomfortable conversation is taking place about what, exactly, the Royal Air Force is now for. The answer, as Clement Attlee's government had grudgingly accepted and Winston Churchill's returning Conservatives confirmed in 1951, is deterrence. The atomic bomb, and shortly the hydrogen bomb, has transformed everything. Britain has chosen to remain a nuclear power. Attlee's cabinet committee took that decision in 1947, with Ernest Bevin growling famously that the country must have the bloody Union Jack on top of it. By the early 50s, the V-bomber force is taking shape. Valiant, Victor, Vulcan, the three deterrent aircraft that will form the spearhead of British strategic policy for the next decade. But deterrence cuts both ways. If Britain is to threaten Moscow with the bomb, then the Soviets are perfectly capable of threatening London, Manchester, and Liverpool with theirs. The Tupolev Tu-4, a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29, has entered Soviet service. The Tu-16 Badger is coming. The Tu-95 Bear, with its monstrous range, is on the drawing board. And the prevailing fear in the Joint Intelligence Committee is that sooner or later, a wave of Soviet bombers will come thundering across the North Sea, carrying weapons capable of erasing British cities in a single afternoon. The interceptors then in RAF service are simply not up to it. The Gloucester Meteor is a Second World War design. The de Havilland Vampire and Venom are pleasant little aircraft, but no match for a modern jet bomber. The Hawker Hunter, beautiful as it is a daylight dogfighter, not a stratospheric killer. The air staff needs something quite different. An aircraft that can sit on quick reaction alert at a Lincolnshire airfield, scramble within minutes, claw its way to 50,000 feet faster than any other machine in NATO, and put cannon and missiles into a high-altitude Soviet bomber before it can release. This is the operational requirement that begins in 1947 as Specification F.23/49. It demands transonic, then supersonic performance. It demands a climb rate that, on paper, looks frankly insane. And it lands on the desk of one of the most uncompromising engineers Britain has ever produced. W.E.W. Teddy. Petter, formerly of Westland and the brain behind the wartime whirlwind, is by now chief designer at English Electric in Preston. Petter is austere, irritable, ferociously clever, and possessed of a temper that subordinates remember decades later. But he understands one thing better than almost anyone in Whitehall, that the era of polite, subsonic British fighters is finished, and that the next aircraft must, in effect, be an engine and a fuel tank with a man strapped to the front. His answer, when it comes, will scandalize the Conservative wing of the Air Ministry. 2 Avon engines, stacked vertically, one above the other in a single fuselage. Heavily swept wings, almost delta in plan form. A nose, intake with a shock cone. A thrust-to-weight ratio so high that, in the right conditions, the aircraft can be flown vertically. It is not so much a fighter as a manned rocket. In Whitehall, the Treasury blanches at the cost. In the Air Ministry, senior officers mutter that Petter has gone mad. But the threat from the east is real, and the chiefs of staff, for once, are prepared to gamble. The aircraft that emerges is given the prosaic designation P.1. It is, by any standard, the most aggressive piece of British military hardware to enter testing since the war. On August 4th, 1954, at RAF Boscombe, down in Wiltshire, the P-1A makes its first flight in the hands of Roland Beamont. Beamont is a man Britain knows already. A Hurricane and Tempest pilot during the war, 21 operational victories, twice shot down over occupied Europe, twice escaped, finally captured in 1944 and held at Stalag Luft 3. By the early 1950s, he is English Electric's chief test pilot, and he has nursed the Canberra bomber through its own development. The Lightning's predecessor, in other words, is being trusted to a man who has already done the impossible twice. 3 days later, on only its third flight, the P.1A goes supersonic in level flight without using reheat, a feat which embarrasses several American programs that have not managed the same thing with afterburner blazing. The Air Ministry briefly allows itself to be pleased. Development drags on. Petter, true to form, has fallen out with management at English Electric and decamped to Folland to design the Gnat. His successor, Frederick Page, inherits the Lightning and pushes it through the long agony of weapons integration, radar fit, and reheated Avons. The air staff specification changes. The requirement balloons. The Treasury grumbles. And then, in April 1957, the entire program almost dies. Duncan Sandys, the defense minister and Churchill's son-in-law, publishes a defense white paper which becomes one of the most controversial documents in post-war British military history. Sandys argues baldly that the era of the manned fighter is ending. Surface-to-air missiles, he insists, will do the job better, cheaper, and more reliably. Future air defence will be a matter of bloodhounds and thunderbirds rising from Lincolnshire silos. Most British aircraft projects, the white paper announces, are to be cancelled. Only the Lightning, already too far advanced to kill, is permitted to survive. And even then, only as an interim measure until missiles take over completely. The 1957 white paper is, in retrospect, a catastrophe. It strangles the British aircraft industry in its cradle, kills off projects such as the supersonic Avro 730 and the magnificent TSR.2 in all but name, and leaves the RAF, by the late 1960s, dependent on American types. But Sandys, accidentally, has saved the Lightning by sparing it. For the next 30 years, the RAF's high-altitude interception will be done by an aircraft no defence minister truly wanted to keep. The Lightning F-1 enters squadron service in 1960 with No. 74 Squadron at RAF Coltishall in Norfolk. The pilots who climb into it are, almost to a man, astonished. Nothing in the RAF has ever accelerated like this, from brake release to 36,000 feet in under 3 minutes, to 50,000 feet in under 4. The aircraft can be flown vertically on the climb. It can sustain Mach 2 in clean configuration. Its rate of climb at sea level is over 50,000 feet per minute, a figure that NATO simply has not seen before. And across the Iron Curtain, the Soviets are watching. Their own designers in Mikoyan and Sukhoi are working on the MiG-21 and the early Sukhoi Flagon. Their reconnaissance pilots are already probing British airspace, testing fighter command's response times. In Washington, meanwhile, the Central Intelligence Agency has been operating its own ultra-high altitude aircraft for 4 years, the U-2, and Alan Dulles' analysts believe it to be untouchable. In May 1960, 6,000 miles east of Binbrook, that conviction is about to be shattered. On May 1st, 1960, Soviet air defenses over Sverdlovsk fire an SA-2 surface-to-air missile at a U-2 piloted by an American called Francis Gary Powers. The aircraft, which CIA briefings have repeatedly insisted is beyond the reach of any interceptor or missile, comes apart at around 70,000 feet. Powers parachutes into the hands of the KGB. The wreckage, more importantly, falls largely intact onto Soviet soil. The diplomatic catastrophe is immediate. President Eisenhower, who has been briefed that the Soviets cannot possibly recover a U-2 pilot alive, denies the overflights. Khrushchev, with the showman's instinct of a Ukrainian peasant turned dictator, springs his trap, produces the pilot, produces the photographs, and humiliates the Americans in front of the world's press. In London, the reaction is more measured, but no less serious. Harold Macmillan's government has not been formally informed of every U-2 mission. The Americans have flown some from RAF bases without telling the Foreign Office in advance, and there is a quiet, furious sequence of meetings in Carlton Gardens. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired by Sir Patrick Dean, demands to know precisely what the CIA has been up to over Britain's airspace and from Britain's airfields. The answer, when it eventually comes, is not entirely reassuring. But beneath the diplomatic embarrassment lies a far more important strategic question, one which lands on the desk of Air Chief Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, Chief of the Air Staff. If the Soviets can knock down a U-2 at 70,000 feet, what guarantee is there that the Soviets cannot also build a reconnaissance aircraft of their own at similar altitudes? And if they do, flying over the home counties, over the V-bomber dispersal airfields at Marham and Scampton, over the dockyards at Devonport and Rosyth, what exactly in the RAF inventory will be able to climb up and bring it down? The answer, on paper, is the Lightning. But on paper is one thing. In practice, nobody at Fighter Command actually knows how high the Lightning can really go. The official specification gives the F-1 a service ceiling of around 54,000 feet. The improved F-3 will push that to perhaps 60,000 feet. The F-6, the definitive variant entering service in the mid-1960s, will officially manage 56,000 feet at combat weight. None of these figures, on the face of it, gets the Lightning anywhere near a U-2's cruising altitude, let alone a putative Soviet equivalent. But quietly, very quietly, English Electric's test pilots have begun whispering about something they call the zoom climb. If you take a Lightning, accelerate to maximum speed at around 40,000 feet, then pull up smoothly into a steep climb on full reheat, the aircraft continues to gain altitude long after the air has thinned beyond the point where the engines can sustain level flight. The wings stop flying. The engines flame out. The pilot is, in effect, riding a ballistic missile. The question that begins to circulate at Boscombe Down, at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and in classified files at RAF High Wycombe is simply this: how high? Tests are authorized. Hand-picked test pilots are briefed. Pressure suits, the same partial pressure garments worn by Canberra crews on PR sorties, are issued. And one summer afternoon in the early 1960s, a Lightning F.3 takes off from Warton in Lancashire, points its nose at the sun, and disappears into the upper atmosphere on a trajectory that no British aircraft has ever flown before. The results, when they come back, are not declassified for 30 years. The cockpit of an English Electric Lightning at 80,000 feet is no place for the casual aviator. The sky outside the canopy is no longer blue. It is a deep, glassy indigo, almost violet, fading at the upper edge into something close to black. The horizon is curved. The pilot can see, distinctly, the spherical shape of the planet beneath him. Beneath the visor of his pressure helmet, he is breathing pure oxygen. Outside, the temperature is approaching -50 Celsius. If his cockpit pressurization fails at this altitude, his blood will boil in his veins inside 15 seconds. This, by the mid-1960s, is the working environment of a small group of RAF and English Electric test pilots, men such as Jimmy Dell and Roland Beamont himself. They have taken the Lightning, time and again, on what becomes known in the squadron messes as the long climb. Accelerate to Mach 2 at 40,000 feet. Pull up at 23 degrees nose high. Hold the climb. Watch the altimeter unwind in the wrong direction. Watch the engines, starved of oxygen, begin to surge and stall. Roll inverted at the apex. Recover. The altitudes they reach, in successive flights, climb steadily. 70,000 feet, 75,000, 80,000. By the late 1960s, several pilots have taken Lightnings past 85,000 feet. A handful claim 88,000, even 90,000. Beamont, in retirement, will later tell the Royal Aeronautical Society that he believes the Lightning's true ballistic ceiling was in excess of 100,000 feet, well above any U-2, well above any Soviet bomber, and crucially within striking distance of an SR-71 Blackbird in level cruise. The frontline squadrons begin to practice. At Binbrook, at Wattisham, at Leuchars, in Fife, Lightning crews drill the high-altitude intercept profile against drone targets, against Canberras flown to extreme altitudes, against the occasional cooperative U-2 deployed temporarily to RAF Alconbury or Mildenhall. The Americans, who have hosted U-2 operations from British soil since the 1950s under a quiet agreement first thrashed out by Anthony Eden and Eisenhower, agree with some reluctance to play the bandit. They regret it almost immediately. The first time a Lightning gun camera frame shows a U-2 in the central reticle at 65,000 feet, the Americans assume the photograph is fabricated. The second time, they asked the RAF to demonstrate it in front of US Air Force observers. The third time, in a celebrated incident, an exasperated American major reportedly remarks that he had not previously believed the British could embarrass him in his own briefing room. Then there are the SR-71 Blackbirds, operating out of RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk from the mid-1970s. The SR-71 cruises at over 80,000 feet at Mach 3. NATO doctrine treats it as untouchable by anything short of a Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat firing on a perfect intercept profile. Yet Mike Hale, the same flight lieutenant whose 1984 Zoom climb opened this story, achieves a gun camera lock on an SR-71 from a Lightning F6. The Americans, again, ask quietly that this be kept out of the official record. Why does the Lightning succeed where everything else fails? The mathematics are unforgiving. 2 Rolls-Royce Avon 301Rs, each producing over 16,000 pounds of thrust in reheat. A combat weight, clean, of around 41,000 pounds. A thrust-to-weight ratio that briefly exceeds 1:1, meaning the aircraft can accelerate vertically. No other Western interceptor in the 1960s, not the McDonnell F-4 Phantom, not the Convair F-106 Delta Dart, not the Mirage 3, has anything approaching this performance. For a brief moment, in a narrow window between Sputnik and the satellite age, Britain owns the upper sky. The Lightning's triumphs come at a price, and the price is paid by the men who fly it. The aircraft has, even by the standards of 1960s military aviation, an alarming attrition rate. Of the 337 Lightnings built for the RAF, more than 100 are lost in accidents. Some go down to engine fires. The upper Avon, mounted directly above the lower, has a habit of cooking surrounding components. Some are lost to fuel exhaustion, the aircraft's notorious short range catching out pilots who have lingered too long in Afterburner. Some are simply lost to the appalling demands placed on the airframe by repeated supersonic and high-altitude flying. 53 RAF pilots are killed in lightning accidents between 1959 and 1988. Many more eject successfully, often from aircraft that have failed at altitudes where ejection is itself a near suicidal procedure. The Martin Baker seats, themselves a British engineering triumph, saved dozens of lives that would, in any other interceptor of the era, simply have been lost. The Lightning is, in its own way, the most dangerous aircraft the RAF has flown in peacetime since the Hawker Hunter. There are political costs too. The Sandys White Paper of 1957 has left the British aircraft industry mortally wounded. The Lightning's commercial export prospects, which English Electric had hoped to leverage in the early 1960s, are limited by the same Treasury parsimony that nearly killed the project at home. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait will eventually buy small numbers, the so-called Lightning Mark 53, in deals brokered by the Wilson government and later by the Heath administration. But the Lightning never becomes the world-beating export the Air Ministry quietly hoped for. The Phantom, the Mirage, and the MiG-21 dominate the international market. Worse, the failure to develop a successor is felt acutely. In 1965, Harold Wilson's Labour government cancels the BACT-SR.2, the supersonic strike aircraft that ought to have been the Lightning's natural stablemate and replacement. In 1967, the alternative American F-111K order is also cancelled. The RAF is forced to procure the McDonnell F-4 Phantom from the United States, fitted in a peculiarly British compromise with Rolls-Royce Spey engines. The Phantom is a fine aircraft. It is not a Lightning. It cannot climb like a Lightning. It cannot intercept at the altitudes a Lightning can reach. For 2 decades, despite repeated attempts by successive governments to replace it, the Lightning remains the only aircraft in the RAF inventory genuinely capable of high-altitude interception of a Soviet reconnaissance platform. It soldiers on through the 1970s, through the 1980s, increasingly elderly, increasingly expensive to maintain, increasingly cannibalized for spares. Squadrons disband one by one. Binbrook, the last great Lightning base, becomes a place of pilgrimage for aviation enthusiasts in the final years. There is an intelligence cost as well, less obvious but no less real. The very fact that the Lightning could reach altitudes the Americans believed safe means, by implication, that Soviet interceptors might be developing similar capabilities. The Joint Intelligence Committee in the late 1960s begins to take seriously the possibility that the new MiG-25 Foxbat, which has astonished Western analysts with its performance during exercises over Egypt, might be capable of zoom climbing well above the U-2's cruise altitude. The defection of Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko in 1976, who flew his Foxbat to Hakodate in Japan, eventually confirms that the MiG-25 cannot quite match such feats. But the worry of the previous decade has been real. Britain, in showing what was possible, had also warned what might be coming. The Lightning's slow retirement is one of the most prolonged operational endings of any RAF aircraft in the post-war era. The final 2 squadrons, numbers 5 and 11, soldier on at Binbrook into the late 1980s, by which time the aircraft is older than most of its pilots. The replacement, the Panavia Tornado F-3, itself a stretched and reworked Tornado bomber, optimized for long-range patrol over the North Sea, assumes the air defense role progressively. The Tornado F.3 has range. It has sky-flash missiles. It has a sophisticated radar. What it does not have, conspicuously, is the climb performance of the aircraft it replaces. On June 30th, 1988, the last operational Lightning sortie is flown from Binbrook. Crowds gather along the perimeter fence. Old pilots, men who flew the F-1 in the early 1960s under figures such as Air Vice Marshal Christopher Foxley Norris, stand in respectful silence. The aircraft is photographed, filmed, and finally taxied to dispersal. An era in British air defence, the era of the small, ferocious, short-ranged interceptor designed to sprint upwards and kill quickly, ends quietly in a Lincolnshire afternoon. The strategic context in which the Lightning had been designed has, by 1988, evaporated. Gorbachev is in the Kremlin. Glasnost is in the air. The Soviet long-range aviation threat against which the Lightning had been the first line of defense is, within 3 years, in the process of being disbanded. The Cold War, which created the Lightning, is ending almost as the Lightning itself retires. But the lessons of the program reverberate through British defence policy for years afterwards. The Ministry of Defence in Whitehall draws conclusions, some bitter, about the cost of dependence on American hardware. The phantom procurement of the late 1960s is widely regarded by the Chiefs of Staff and by historians such as David Reynolds and Eric Grove as a strategic mistake. The cancellation of TSR.2 looms larger in retrospect than it did at the time. By the mid-1980s, the Thatcher government, having seen what indigenous design could achieve when properly funded and what its absence cost, has committed to the European fighter aircraft program, which will eventually become the Eurofighter Typhoon. The Typhoon, in its own way, is the Lightning's spiritual successor. A twin-engined, high-performance air superiority fighter designed in Europe rather than the United States, with a thrust-to-weight ratio that finally exceeds the Lightning's own. The decision-makers in the MOD's procurement executive in the 1980s and 1990s, figures such as Sir Michael Quinlan and Sir Peter Levine, were shaped, whether they acknowledged it or not, by the memory of what Britain had once been able to do with English Electric in Preston, before Sandys and the Treasury had between them taken a hatchet to the industry. There is also a special relationship dimension that historians such as Christopher Andrew and David Reynolds have explored in detail. The Lightning's quiet humiliations of the U-2 and the SR-71 fed into a long-running, never quite public British insistence that the junior partner in the Anglo-American intelligence and defence relationship was not always quite so junior in capability. RAF Strike Command, RAF Mildenhall, RAF Alconbury, GCHQ at Cheltenham. At each of these nodes, the British and Americans cooperated closely, but the file marked Lightning versus U-2, when finally declassified in the 2000s, remained a small, quiet, very British reminder that the technology of the Imperial ally was not always quite as untouchable as Washington had liked to claim. The aircraft was gone. Its meaning, in Whitehall and at Mildenhall, lingered. What does the story of the English Electric Lightning tell us about Britain in the Cold War? It tells us, first, that the post-war British aircraft industry, despite Sandys, despite the Treasury, despite the ruinous economics of post-imperial decline, was capable, in flashes, of producing world-leading technology. The Lightning, the V-bombers, the Harrier, Concorde. In each case, small teams of engineers in Preston, Bristol, Kingston upon Thames, and Filton built aircraft that the Americans could not match, and in some respects never tried to. The Lightning's ability to reach altitudes that NASA, the CIA, and the USAF had jointly declared impossible was not a fluke. It was the product of an aerospace culture that, when permitted to flourish, was second to none in the world. It tells us, second, that the story of British defence policy in the second half of the 20th century is, at heart, a story of choices not taken. The cancellation of TSR Dot 2 in 1965, the cancellation of the supersonic Avro 7-3, the strangling of the indigenous fighter line after the 1957 White Paper. These were decisions taken in Whitehall by defence ministers who genuinely believed at the time that they were making the country safer and the books cleaner. In retrospect, they made Britain dependent on the United States in a way that previous generations would have found unthinkable. The lightning is a reminder of what was possible before that dependence took hold. It tells us, third, something about the special relationship itself. The image of a Royal Air Force flight lieutenant in a 25-year-old British interceptor sliding into firing position behind a state-of-the-art American spy plane, an aircraft the CIA itself had declared untouchable, is not merely a Cold War curiosity, it is a parable. The junior partner, properly motivated and properly equipped, can still surprise the senior. British capability, properly applied, can still embarrass American certainty. From Suez in 1956 to the Falklands in 1982, from Hong Kong to Helmand, this lesson recurs in the small print of the Anglo-American partnership. And it tells us, finally, something about the men who flew the aircraft. Mike Hale, Jimmy Dell, Roland Beamont, the dozens of others whose names appear in the squadron records at Binbrook and Wattisham and Leuchars. They climbed into a famously dangerous aeroplane in famously bad weather, against famously demanding targets, and they did so with an unfussy professionalism that is one of the defining cultural inheritances of the post-war Royal Air Force. They did not boast, they simply did the job. And when, at altitudes where blood will boil in a punctured cabin, they put their gun cameras on aircraft, the rest of the world said could not be touched, they did so with the matter-of-factness of men who had been raised on a diet of Spitfire stories and Battle of Britain pilots and quietly intended to live up to them. The lightning is gone now. A few survive in museums, at Duxford, at Cosford, at East Fortune near Edinburgh. The rest have been scrapped or sit decaying on disused dispersals. But the next time you read of a Russian Bear bomber being intercepted off the Scottish coast by an RAF Typhoon, remember where that tradition began. It began with a stubby, twin-engined, fuel-thirsty British interceptor that nobody quite wanted to fund and nobody quite knew how to kill. If you've enjoyed this story of British engineering and Cold War audacity, do hit the like button, subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's military past, and tell me in the comments, should the Lightning have been replaced sooner, or did Britain retire her too soon?